funding. And it compared and contrasted the monies that the state puts in annually based on the funding formula and the amount that municipal government is responsible for. And the report, and Justine Oliva is here from the Rhode Island Public Expenditure Council. She's the Director of Policy and Research, and I found out this morning that she's a very good friend of my niece. I didn't know that. But Justine is a Rhode Island native. She has a degree in secondary education and an advanced degree in history. She's been with RIPEC for approximately 6 years now. And again, RIPEC has done a lot of work on school funding and education. They did their own report about declining enrollment. So without further ado, I'll have Justine walk you through the numbers, and as I'm sure most of you suspect, the municipal contribution that you get is probably not enough, and it should be more, but Justine's going to take us through that. I serve with her on a commission at the Rhode Island Foundation that's looking at the funding formula, and hopefully will recommend some changes to it that impacts how we get funded. Justine? You get a slide advancer there.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay, thank you. That was a very nice welcome. I appreciate it. So my parents met at the University of Rhode Island and never left, and I'm still there, for folks that are wondering where I'm located. Thank you very much for having me. For folks that are unfamiliar with RIPEC, this is my About RIPEC slide. So we're a pretty old organization. We celebrated our 90th anniversary a little while ago. There we go. And we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit public policy research organization. Our mission is to advance fiscally responsible government, competitive tax policies, and economic opportunities for all in Rhode Island. And we focus on some main policy issues. I would note we're a relatively small team, and so this is a pretty big agenda for a pretty small research team. We've long focused on state finance, municipal finance, tax policy, the economy. We've been focusing on K-12 education, finance, and reform, apologies, since the 1990s. And we've more recently stepped out into housing. So over the last several years, we've done a number of reports on the state funding formula, on education funding, education reform. We did a report on enrollment and chronic absenteeism a few years ago, and we've been reporting in our annual budget reports on changes that have been made to the state funding formula over the last several years. We've also been publishing over the last several years on property taxation. We put out a number of reports on property tax. In those reports, we talk about the fact that this has large implications for K-12 funding, but we did not dive into it, I guess, in the same extent that we did in this report. This report more explicitly links K-12 funding and property taxes. And so what this presentation does is it takes you through some K-12 trends, and it takes you through some property tax trends, and it puts them together. I'd say that this presentation doesn't strictly follow the report pictured here, but it does, it is rooted off that. Oh, and before I begin, just a quick note on the data. I'm always using the most recent available data to me. Sometimes that data might be a few years old. So for instance, with my K-12 finance data, I am only going up to FY 2023. You all have information that is more recent than I do in terms of what's happening with your budgets. The property tax information that I have is mostly going up to 2025. And there are a few instances where I use US Census Bureau data, and in consequence of that, that data doesn't look quite the same as the data that I get from Rhode Island. And so certain numbers, like what exactly the state and local split in K-12 funding is, are a little bit different. I'll try to point this out as we go. The trends look the same no matter what, but the numbers from one slide to the next might look slightly off depending on the source. The source is also always listed. I believe you all have access to the presentation with a QR code, because another thing I'll note is, because I knew I'd have folks from all communities in the room, I tried to put all communities on a single slide, and so a few of the slides might be a little bit hard to read from up there, but I wanted you all to have that information. Okay. So the first thing to establish, I think, is that in Rhode Island, we are relatively high spenders on K-12 education overall. This is a data source from the U.S. Census Bureau from FY22. It's the most recent available source. I won't say that every time, I promise, but that's the truth. So we're 8th highest, but as you will also note here, showing all of New England, that we are not relatively high spenders compared to our neighbors in New England. We're in a very high spending region. And that puts real pressure on us, the fact that in Connecticut they're spending more and in Massachusetts they're spending more, when there is competition for, teachers, staff, right? The pressures of being right next to those states matter. And the high spend of those states also impacts the funding formula and leads to greater increases in what the state gives. We are also a high cost of living place, but we spend a little bit more than our cost of living would suggest. So generally, at least in terms of national trends, Rhode Island is doing okay in terms of spending. That spending has also gone up in recent years. I would note that this only goes up to 2023, and so we want to be cautious with this data. I'll go over it in the next few slides. But per pupil spending overall, this statewide figure has been rising in recent years, and that's even accounting for high inflation. So this blue line here shows the increase in per pupil expenditures in current dollars and the dollars that we use today. Well, I'm sorry, in the dollars that we use today from 2011 to 2023. This orange line, what I did is I tied it to the inflation rate, and so I tied it to $2011, and so if per pupil spending was only going up at the rate of inflation, what we would see is a straight line. As you can see here, it's only going up a little bit above inflation for a long period of time, but over this period between the beginning of the pandemic and 2023, there was this larger jump in per pupil spending. There are 2 points I want to make on that, and I will point out the ESSER thing. Yes, I thank you. That's, I think, why we want to be careful with the up to 2023 number. Partially, this is because the number of students that you have are down, and we all know that it's not always easy to pull back a budget just because you've lost students one year over the other. And so part of the reason why you're seeing an increase per pupil is because there are significantly less pupils. I once again want to point out that this is data that really shows a trend. But this is not the exact data that's used to determine the state funding formula. This is October 1st enrollment. They use March 15th enrollment at the state. The point of this was really just to show you the trend, which is that in total, public school enrollment in the state is down significantly. Essentially with the beginning of the pandemic, there was this large drop in enrollment across the state, but in some communities, far more than others, which we can discuss in a little bit. And that never really rebounded. What we've seen in the last few years, as I think probably Mario told you in greater and better detail, is more akin to demographic decline. But during the pandemic, there was a loss of students to, we believe, private schools, although the data's not great, homeschooling, an increase of students dropping out. And the result is that we now just have a system with fewer kids in it, and then we're also dealing with the demographic decline. And then I think that the main piece, right, yes, as mentioned back there, right, these ESSER funds is a huge piece of why there was this increase in per pupil spending, and we'll expect when we see data past FY23 for per pupil spending to go down a little bit and maybe reach more of that kind of inflation level. This figure here shows funding by source in FY 2012, the first year of the funding formula, FY 2019, so the full fiscal year before the pandemic, and then FY 2023, the most recent year for which we have data. And this, I guess, turquoise color at the top is the federal amount, and as you can see, it grew really dramatically. In FY 2012, dollars from Race to the Top, I believe, were still in the system, and so in 2019, there was actually fewer dollars from the federal government in RI K-12 funding than there was in 2012, but then it really exploded with ESSER aid. This is a 150% increase over 4 years of federal dollars. So this large growth is in part due to federal sources, which were required obligation, and it's also in part due to a large growth in state sources, which we'll get into in greater detail. Oops, or we won't. Did I press something wrong? Yes, I did. Okay. All right. So in the United States, what's the most common, or the average, is that state and local governments each kick in an equal share. The federal government, this orange here, or sorry, orange, yellow, I don't know. This federal, I need work on my colors apparently. The federal government share is around 10%. In Rhode Island, it's around 10% in the US. These are both pre-COVID, for the most part, figures. Rhode Island on the top in FY 2012, the first year of the funding formula, and FY 2021, and then the US average on the bottom. You can see they're both roughly reliant on federal funds, but then Rhode Island, when the formula began in FY 2012, was significantly more reliant on local sources than was the case in the United States. Now that's changed, and in the next few slides I'm going to talk about that change in a little bit more detail, but Rhode Island is still more reliant on local revenue sources than is the case in the US overall, where there's more of this equal share between state and local government. But once again, that kind of depends on the state. This is the average. So in this slide, I've taken out the federal share, so putting that to the side for a moment and talking just about the state and local split. This is a different data source, I'll point out again, than the previous slide. This is US Census Bureau data that I used in order to make the comparison. This is me using RIDE-UCOA data, and so the percentages aren't quite the same, but you can still see the same trend. And once again, I picked out these 3 years of 2012, 2019, and 2023 to make the to show comparison. And what you can see is that Rhode Island is still more reliant, but now more in line with the US in this 1-1 split. And also that there's been this really large movement of increase in the proportion of total aid that the state is taking up statewide relative to what local governments are kicking in. Still, it's 55% local to 45% state, but this is a really large shift that represents a very significant amount of money. They're not easy shifts to make when you're talking about proportions with such a big base. And the other thing I want to point out here is that when you break out 2019, instead of just showing 2012 to 23, one of the things that you see is that this is something that's continuing to happen. It's not something that's happened between 2012 and 2019 and then stopped. It's not something that really sped up in the last 4 years. This is a more long-standing trend that we've seen during the formula's implementation and also since the pandemic. This is a depiction of really those pies, but giving you the nominal amount and the percent change. So Rhode Island's state and local mix resulted from really much larger state aid increases relative to local aid increases to K-12 education. So on the right here, we have the state increase. It grew at an average annual rate of 7.5%. Between FY 2012 and FY 23, and that amounted to an additional $580 million that the state is now putting into the system relative to what it was putting in in 2012. Local governments, a 2.2% average annual increase. That base was bigger than the states to begin with, and so while it's less than 3 times the rate, it's about half the nominal increase that state has put in terms of growth in K-12 aid. Something that we've been tracking at RIPEC in our reports on the state funding formula, however, and a concern that we have is that a smaller share of those increases are going to those districts that have the largest proportion of low-income students, and as we'll talk about a little bit more later in the deck, the highest proportion, the lowest amount of property wealth to tax. So this bar to the left shows the proportion of additional state aid that went to urban core districts relative to all other districts during the years that the formula was implemented from FY 12 to 21. And then the figure to the right here shows the same thing, but for FY 21 to FY 25. This is just state aid. The local share is not depicted in this slide. RIPEC defines the urban core. There's different definitions, but RIPEC defines the urban core as Central Falls, Pawtucket, Providence, West Warwick, and Woonsocket. We arrived at this definition because these are the 5 communities that have the 5 lowest levels of property wealth per person, and they also have they are in the bottom 6 for highest proportion of students in poverty, along with Newport, which has significant property wealth, but a high proportion of students in poverty. So what we've seen is that during the formula's implementation, about 60% of new funds went to those 5 districts. Prior to the formula's implementation, it had been about 54%. In the last 4 years, that's dropped to around half. Partially, but not entirely, that's due to enrollment decrease in the urban core being greater than is the case in the state overall. Urban core schools collectively saw a 12% decrease in enrollment from FY21 to 25, compared to 6% for all other districts. It's also a product of a number of changes that have been made to the formula in recent years. I'm going to move a little bit, I think, into the local side again, because despite this really large shift that I just showed you in state and local tax mix, over half of funding for K-12 schools is still from the local share, and most of that is from property tax revenue. Then cities and towns account for this, or I think school committees account for this, because what we've done is we've taken the money that goes directly from the state or federal government to LEAs, and we put it in the same pie as the money that is collected or given to a city or town. We are, considering them as a full amount of municipal revenue, thinking about, how cities and towns have to fund their schools, and trying to combine them in a way that they are not practically combined in terms of governance. So what this shows is that around a third of everything that combined your school districts and the cities and towns are bringing in is, or a little bit, let's say over a quarter, not a third, 28% is this state, federal, and other education aid. There's also other significant state non-education aid, federal aid. That other bucket includes some non-property tax revenues, as well as other sources of revenue that are not necessarily defined in the data source. But 56% of this total is from property tax revenue. And if you're talking about just locally generated revenue, if you take all of this state and federal aid out of the pie, then that's over 90% of all revenues that are relied on by our cities and towns and by our schools are from property tax revenues. I will point out that this pie looks very, very different depending on where you're talking about. And so some communities are much more heavily reliant on property tax revenue because they receive significantly less state, federal, education, and other aid, and some communities are much more reliant on aid from federal and state governments, and much less reliant on property tax revenues when you look at the whole pie. We do have that in not this report, but a previous report, so I could share data that's, I believe, from FY21 or FY22 if people are interested in how this looks in your community. So the funding formula recognizes the importance of property tax revenue to the funding of K-12 education. It incorporates a community's ability to pay into the formula, but at the same time, while recognizing the importance of a location's ability to generate revenue, the requirement, the local maintenance of effort, is relatively weak. I say it's relatively weak relative to what they do in the United States overall or in states overall. It varies a lot depending on states, but compared to most, we have a relatively weak maintenance of effort. The maintenance of effort requires that cities and towns maintain their funding level year over year. If enrollment declines, local contribution may actually be reduced proportionally, but we've seen massive enrollment declines recently, and we are not aware of any city or town utilizing this provision. If you are, please let me know. I don't but I don't believe so, right? So generally you have to maintain year over year, but you don't have to increase, whereas the state does have to increase. What this has ended up doing is it's ended up putting more pressure on state tax revenues and less on property tax revenues over time, right? Because those increases in funding are coming from taxpayers. They are just coming from taxpayers in the form of sales tax and income tax, lottery revenue, other forms of general revenue, rather than from increases in property tax revenue. And I'll go into that a little bit more in a few slides. So this is one of those slides I was talking about where I really wanted to get all our communities on here, but I recognize that it's practically difficult to read unless you have the QR code, which do folks have it? No.
They can access it at the end of the presentation and put it up on the...
Okay, great, great. I would point out that this figure is gross assessed value per capita. I took the Division of Municipal Finance's AWEB study to create this, which is the study that they use to equalize property so that they can determine how much folks get in the funding formula. And then we divided it by the number of full-time residents. We created this image not necessarily to show just how cities and towns have I'm looking for. Cities and towns have capacity to fund their schools, but to show how cities and towns have capacity to fund all local government services, and that's why we do it per capita, not per student, although I recognize that per student would show a different figure and in part explain differences in property taxes across different communities. So for instance, Narragansett, around I believe fewer than 1 in 10 people that live in Narragansett is a school-aged child. In Barrington, 1 in 5 people who live in that community is a school-aged child. And so there's obviously a lot of difference in terms of how many children you are educating depending on where you are in the state. But another weakness of the per capita data, and then I'll stop talking about the weakness of this figure and I'll start talking about its strength. But another weakness is that because it's full-time residents, it doesn't capture for second home communities, it doesn't capture the people that are there part of the year. It also doesn't capture community need because you have a lot of visitors. You're in Newport or Providence. You have a lot of people coming in during the day that are not necessarily full-time residents. So that's the relative weakness of this. But overall, this gives you a good idea of how much each city or town has to work with in terms of property value to fund their services. At the top, I'm not sure if anyone can actually read that, and if you can, congratulations, you have great eyesight. But I took New Shoreham off because it's like $1.5 million and it ruined the scale. They're in the footnote. Everyone else up on the top are these kind of second home communities, which is a term I'm not a huge fan of, given that I live in a community that's becoming one. But Little Compton, Jamestown, Narragansett, Charlestown, Westerly, right? Those communities have a lot of property wealth to work with. They have over $250,000 per person to use as their tax base. Average in the state is, and this once again is older, this would be a lot more if it reflected more recent real estate movement. We'll talk about that in a few slides. But the statewide total is at 163,000, and then you can see that these communities that RIPEC has, or you can't see, these communities that RIPEC has defined as the urban core, the West Warwick, Providence, Pawtucket, Woonsocket, they have $100,000 or less. Central Falls in particular stands out as having a very, very small amount of property wealth to work with. They have under $40,000 per person, which is less than half of the next lowest community, which is Woonsocket. So there's just this very large difference between cities and towns and their ability to generate revenue with property taxes. But what this data shows, right, is that there's increased value that cities and towns have at their, have the ability to tax, recognizing the cap, which I will get to. But there's a huge increase that's occurred in the last few years in property values, in particular residential property values, all property, business property, which is the orange here, and tangible property, which is also a form of business property tax, which is the green here, has also increased in value over this period of time. But residential, which is the blue here, has seen a very large increase. It makes up about 80% of the total property value statewide available to tax. And it grew by about $45 billion in 3 years. In Rhode Island, we have a 3-year assessment schedule, so you do a full revaluation on property after 9 years, and you do a statistical reassessment of property in the 3rd and 6th year after that. Not all communities do this during the same year, and so what this figure actually shows is the increase each year of around 1/3 of Rhode Island communities using historical data. And the consequence of that, this property that was taxed in FY25 was assessed as of 12/31/23, meaning that some communities hadn't done an assessment for 2 years. So for some communities, the number that's going into this figure is property that was assessed as of 12/31/2021. So in consequence, right, this is historical data, and I will never claim to tell the future, but in terms of this, I can tell the future, and I can tell you that this is going to continue to go up at a really high rate for a few years as the assessments continue to come in with historical data to reflect really large increases in residential property value. One thing that we've noted is that low property wealth communities have seen some of the greatest increases in the state. I think a more modest property has seen a greater proportional increase statewide in the real estate market. And so some of our communities that were at the very bottom and remain at the very bottom of that figure for assessed value per capita have also seen the greatest growth in property values. This depicts Central Falls in FY22 and FY25. What is so fascinating about this is that it depicts a 56% increase in total property value between 22 and 25. That's compared to a 37% increase in Rhode Island, even though Central Falls FY25 was the last year before they had to conduct a new reassessment. So for FY26, they have a new reassessment. So this is historical and therefore understates the extent to which property values grows in that community. At the same time, we also saw incomes in those communities rise much faster, or not much faster, but faster than in the state overall. But even given those increases, property values and incomes in urban core communities remain very low relative to the state. So continuing to use the Central Falls example, it's about half of the Rhode Island total. I'll dive a little bit into property taxes now. So in response to this really large increase in property values, cities and towns have reduced rates, right? They did not keep rates the same and tax folks on the full value of their new property. They reduced them. And in particular, what they did is they reduced residential rates or rates on homeowners. So to the left here, it shows the Rhode Island municipal effective tax rate by class of property. Just to be clear, what I did is I effectively calculated what the tax rate was across the entire state of Rhode Island. That's not how it works. You all have separate tax rates in your communities. But if Rhode Island was one community, this would be the effective rate across it. And the residential rate overall in the state in a lot of communities went down faster than commercial property, faster than tangible property. But commercial real estate also went down. Tangible has been kept high. It was capped by recent legislation, but it's also not being brought down. I also, as I'd point out, right, this varies really widely by community. So there are some communities in which there's no difference between rates, where commercial and residential property is taxed at the same rate, and there are other communities where the difference between these classes of property is far wider. So, there is a difference of on $425,000 of assessed value property, over $7,000 in 5 communities, under $3,000 in roughly 5 communities across the state of Rhode Island. So we have this one difference between the tax rate applied to different types of property, and then 2, the difference in tax rate applied to property that's the same type depending on where you live. So you have this kind of disparity between how property is taxed depending on where you live and how it's classified. The difference is even greater for business property. This shows the business tax burden on $1 million in real property or real estate and $200,000 in tangible personal property, which are the movable objects that a business may possess. So everything from office equipment to, if you own a restaurant, your fry-a-later, your cash register, your chairs, et cetera. This is the amount that you would be taxed across different communities. It's very broad, so under $10,000 in our communities that have a lot of property wealth. They also have relatively small amounts of commercial activity, of course, but our communities that have a lot of property wealth, like Jamestown, Charlestown, Little Compton, and then very high levels in communities like Providence, West Warwick, Johnston, of about $40,000. So a very large difference in what you're paying on the same value property depending on where you live. I'd also note that this Providence rate is the 3rd highest of large cities in each state in the country, so it's high based on national levels as well. So one trend that we've noticed is that for these less affluent communities, so our urban core communities, that they have relatively low rates for resident homeowners, but they have very high rates for landlords, renters, and businesses. The commercial rate, as I described, is a rate on commercial real estate. In most communities, it depends on which, because property tax law varies quite a bit between our cities and towns. But in most communities, if you have an apartment with over 5 units, it's classified as commercial property. And so it is taxed at that higher rate for communities that do tax commercial property at a higher rate. A lot of communities, I say a lot, around, I believe 10 communities at this point have homestead exemptions, or they have a separate tax rate that they apply to resident homeowner property. And in that case, you essentially have 4 buckets. You have the amount that the resident homeowner's paying, that non-resident homeowners are paying, or landlords, renters in the form of their rent, and then you have the amount that businesses are paying. So what this figure shows is the Rhode Island total in red, and then our urban core communities in blue. And as you can see, the homeowner tax burden is actually relatively low in some of these least affluent communities, like Providence or Central Falls. They have very They have very large homestead exemptions relative to other communities. So for instance, in, I think Narragansett, it's a 10% homestead exemption. Is someone from Narragansett here to correct? Yes, okay. Narragansett's around a 10% homestead exemption. In Providence, it's 42%, so a lot bigger. It's applied now as a separate rate, but it's still effectively 42% in Providence, right? So it's very different. There we go. This slide provides some historical analysis of the state's 4% levy cap. I'm going to explain it. I apologize if I'm, explaining something that you're well aware of, but I find it can be a little bit confusing. So a levy is an approximation for the total revenue that cities and towns are bringing in from taxes. It's not that. It's a close number to that. It is essentially the total tax bill that a city or town puts out. They may or may not get all of that back every year, right? But it's around the same amount that they are receiving in property tax revenues. It's the amount that they are billing from every person, business, piece of property, et cetera. There is a law in Rhode Island that you cannot exceed the state's 4% levy cap. There are exceptions to this law every year. Or essentially every year, when you go back and you look at the reports, you'll see that it's typical for 1 or 2 or 3 communities to exceed the cap under a number of provisions in the law that allow you to exceed the cap. You could also ask the General Assembly if you can exceed the cap, which is the case in Providence at the moment. But generally, cities and towns are required to stay within this 4% cap. And we often hear it as a barrier to funding municipal government. We often hear people describe it as a barrier to funding greater K-12 education. Our analysis suggests that that's not really the case, as much as it's a choice by municipal governments not to increase property taxes at a greater rate. This figure to the left shows the total statewide municipal levy annual change year over year. This line across the top is the 4% cap, and the blue line below it is the total municipal levy statewide amount. So the most that it is increased year over year is 3.3% in 2024. Typically, it's much lower. Many years it increased by 2%, 2.2%, et cetera. If we look at cities and towns individually, which is what this figure on the right does, we counted the number of cities and towns that increased over 3.90%, because that we felt showed some level of coming up against the cap when you're talking about increases. In most years, very few cities and towns come up against this increase. On average, between 2016 and 2025, about 15% of cities and towns would annually come across this cap, 6 of 39 communities. In the last few years, with the inflationary pressures being higher, more communities have come up against the cap, around 25%. You can see in 2023, 24, 10 communities each year came closer to the cap or exceeded the cap. But overall, it has appeared to be more of a choice on the part of local governments not to come near the 4% cap. Okay, so this is more fun with inflation. Since FY21 property values have exploded, as I showed on a previous slide, but the levy increases have been below inflation. So once again, this blue line shows current dollars, the dollars as they existed that year, and this orange line is tied to inflation. This time it's tied to inflation in FY 2016. So between 2016 and 2025, you would see a straight line if the municipal increases in property tax levy had grown at the same rate as inflation. And interestingly, that is really what you see up until 2021. You see cities and towns overall increasing their property tax levy at just the rate that they need in order to keep pace with inflation, not more, not less. With high inflationary pressures and also large amounts of state and federal aid coming in 22, 23, cities and towns stopped collecting as much in property tax revenue relative to the value of a dollar, and are now collecting less in terms of inflationary levels than they were a few years ago. I'd point out, even as inflation has kind of gone back to normal in the last few years, there have still been very slight decreases in terms of the amount that cities and towns are taking in relative to the value of a dollar. So this shows total general revenue spending in a few different buckets. General revenue is all of state spend, or not all of state spending. It's a significant amount of state spending. It's the largest kind of bucket of self-generated state spending and what they can put towards K-12 education. So state spending has increased well above inflation at the same time that we saw enrollment declining. So inflation grew at an average annual rate of 4.6% between FY20 and FY25, and at the same time, state general revenue K-12 spending grew by 6.6%. If you think about that on a per pupil basis, the fact that we saw a declining enrollment at 7.8%, this is slightly below total general revenue increases. So it's not the fastest growing part of the budget. That's Health and Human Services and Medicaid, but it is growing faster than inflation is, and it is growing much faster than those local revenue increases. This just gives you an idea of where those increases came from. So it shows in the FY 2019 final budget and FY 2025 estimates, which are soon going to change, but the last time we had estimates, how much money is being brought in from various sources. So previously I talked about the fact that if you have increased funding for education from state sources, it's coming from taxpayers, it's just not coming in the form of property tax. This green depicts personal income tax, and the blue depicts sales and use tax. Those are the two biggest buckets of general revenue in the state, and they both grew really dramatically. They didn't grow really dramatically because of changes that were made in terms of the rate that was charged or anything like that. They grew dramatically because people were spending more and because people were making more in the state, and so the state took more in. Now, in contrast, right, property is worth more, but cities and towns did not increase to reflect those changes nearly to the same rate that the state did. So the state held the rate steady and got a lot more. Cities and towns cut, and they cut past the level that, well, they would have had to cut to stay within the 4% cap, but they cut past that level as value increased, right? So we're talking about, rates staying the same while value is going up in personal income tax and sales and use tax. I would like to actually stop a moment, I think, to reflect on this, right? So property is a form of value, a form of wealth. It's not a liquid form of wealth, as we all know, right? And so it's a little bit different. It makes sense that we would treat it a little bit differently. But one of the points of this report is to think about these things together. We often think about them as separate buckets, as separate taxpayers. We think about municipal revenue as being somehow separate from state revenue, or the taxpayers that are paying property taxes as somehow different than the taxpayers that are paying personal income or sales and use taxes. Now they can be, right? If you are someone who doesn't work in Rhode Island but owns a home in Rhode Island, you're paying one form of tax but not another. But generally, right, we're talking about taxes being applied to people in Rhode Island. And there's been this shift away from a focus on property tax and more of a focus on personal income and sales and use tax. And that has affected the way that we are funding K-12. Okay. So these next two slides, once again, I understand they're difficult to read, but I wanted to get every community into the deck. And so or not community, district into the deck. So most districts, when you look at this at the district level, we previously have been looking at the state level. At the district level, most districts, but not all, saw relatively low levels of increase in local sources relative to state sources. And one thing that we noted is that this is something that's apparent in urban, suburban, and rural districts. So there's been a lot of attention in the media, for instance, on the local share in Providence. But one thing that we noted is that Providence isn't at the bottom of the list here in terms of local revenue increases relative to state revenue increases. I'll explain, I guess, a little bit about what this figure shows. So this is UCOA data. It's from FY 2019 to FY 23. It shows increases in local aid, which is about 97% property tax revenues, municipal appropriations to local governments. And then it shows increases in state revenue, which is primarily the state funding formula, not entirely, that go towards these schools. Now, if you're sending students out of district to attend a charter school or another LEA or another public school, the increases follow the student. They are not reflected in this figure. And so this is not going to look, the same as the budgets that are directly in front of you. This shows general trends of local money going in to support the students that are being educated in your district and live in your district, and the same at the state level. But it's not the same exact number that you're going to see if you go back and look at the budget. And what this shows, again, is that across districts with varying levels of property wealth and varying types of student populations, there have been relatively low increases at the local level relative to the state level, but once again, it's not all districts. We also, on the figure to the right here, have shown the enrollment change over this period of time. Enrollment is not the only reason why your state share might have changed, but we thought that this was kind of helped maybe make sense of some of the numbers or provided some context of the numbers. One person could argue, if I'm in a district that's seen 20% of my students go in the last 5, 6, 7 years, do my increases need to be as much as a district that's actually seen a slight increase? Because a few districts have seen slight increases. So that's why we've provided that context. But of course, it's not the only concern. It's not the only thing that goes into the funding formula. It's not the only thing that goes into your budgets. It doesn't cost the same to educate all students. So the result of these local and state increases is that some urban core districts have lower per pupil expenditures than Rhode Island LEAs overall. At RIPEC, we feel that that's an issue because of the increased costs of educating students in poverty and multilingual learners who are very heavily concentrated in these districts. And ultimately, that is the result of the funding formula, and it's also the result of local funding decisions to not increase property tax revenues at certain times, or to increase property tax revenues but not send that money to the schools, and allowing the state to continue to pick up a larger share. It's also the consequence of the state funding formula not directing quite as much money towards the urban core. The COVID money is not showing up anymore, so this is FY 23. So for instance, Providence, quite high here. Providence will come down. They received a lot of ESSER 3 funds that are being reflected in those dollars. I believe that's it. I wanted to let folks know that this report is on our website, that there is a one-page executive summary that's also on our website, and that we also constructed a data dashboard so that you could manipulate some of this data if you are interested in it. So some of these figures that show the 39 cities and towns or the 36 school districts, it allows you to kind of manipulate the data across years, across factors like types of property value. Most of it is property tax data, some of it is education data. I'm happy to take any questions if there's time. I assume there's time. Hi. Yeah.
So I'm not on the municipal
So the complication that property tax is not a liquid asset is a real one. We have a number of recommendations in the report around, firstly, I think revamping, and I probably should have included the recommendations in this deck, but one, revamping the funding formula at the state level is our number one recommendation. We think that there needs to be change there. At the local level, we think that there are changes that could be made to property tax systems to increase revenue, while at the same time factoring in that you have folks that have fixed income, or that you have folks that have need, that don't necessarily bring greater, as we see it, inequity to the property tax system. So what a lot of cities and towns will do is they will, for instance, enact a homestead exemption. They will say, all right, well, let's tax resident homeowners at a lower rate, and we'll shift the property tax burden, or maybe they don't think about it this way, but what it essentially does is it shifts the property tax burden to businesses. Part of the issue is that then it also shifts the property tax burden to apartment buildings, which are taxed as businesses. It also shifts the property tax burden if you, for instance, put a homestead exemption in to landlords. Landlords are going to make up that cost in value of rent. Renters are more likely to be housing cost burden than our homeowners. And so sometimes these very well-intentioned policies that seek to provide property tax relief to folks are too broad in our estimation and don't have the intended impact to really focus the property tax relief on the folks that need it most, which is why we recommend that cities and towns look into expanding programs that all of them already have. The vast majority of cities and towns, all cities and towns have exemption programs of some sort or another for seniors, for veterans, for disabled folks. Not all of those are income restricted. We recommend that they are. So essentially, you can create programs for people that are income restricted, for means tested programs like tax deferral programs, like providing a tax credit that reduces their property tax burden and that really focuses need on folks that need it, rather than providing a tax break to all homeowners. Because RIPEC is of the opinion, right, that all homeowners aren't necessarily cost burden. And when you try to provide property tax relief to all resident homeowners, what you end up doing is putting more pressure on other parts of the system, which can cause problems in terms of economic development and making housing affordable. And so it's a very long-winded answer. I'm sorry. I could go off on it for a very long time. But so what I would say is that property tax revenues cannot be increased for the most part by more than 4% per year. In a normal year, those 2 years of very high inflation aside, cities and towns have in their capacity to increase property taxes at a rate that keeps up with inflation, at least, right? And if there's concern, and I think it's fair concern, right, that some folks in your community are housing cost burden, that you have elderly folks on a fixed income, then there are programs that are in existence now that you could expand and make more meaningful that would apply property tax relief to those in your community who really need it most, and not put a broad level of relief off, all homeowners, or just tax everyone much less and not put in money for your schools. I also want to say I recognize the complications of, setting a budget and not being able to raise the revenues for that budget. I think that that's a kind of a separate and much related governance issue in the state in terms of how we get to a place where we fund our schools. That figure that's the pie that I have of all the municipal revenues, one of the reasons we do that is a lot of cities and towns don't necessarily consider the school budget as part of their budget, as part of their spending, because it's to the side, right? The money that doesn't go to them, they're not thinking about it as part of that pie. At RIPEC, we think it's important that cities and towns think of it as part of that pie, right? And that they're counted all together. So I hope that was helpful. Yes?
I would just encourage what I refer to as a resort community, and I would encourage you to look at other factors as well as housing value when proposing budgetary changes to funding allocations. Housing is a part of it, but for the folks that live in those communities, it's a challenge. It's a real challenge to pay for housing. It's a real challenge to pay for additional property taxes. Our housing prices have more than doubled in the last few years. Those aren't the folks that actually live there. Those are the resort homes, the second homes, the ones that are oceanfront. that they don't live in our community. And yes, we can tax them, but those tax rates also impact the folks that live in our community that work in grocery stores, that work in the restaurants, that are the plumbers, the electricians, that are just the same as anybody else in any other town.
Yeah, so thank you for saying that. Is someone from Middletown here? I think, no? So Middletown's doing something that's interesting where they are moving to apply their homestead exemption to full-time residents and to rental properties that have a full year lease. And so they are more targeting the second home folks. And I think that there's more of a good ethical argument, I think, or I think there are other policies that you can look into that kind of target more providing, raising tax revenue on the second home folks relative to the folks that are trying to actually live in those communities, specifically for second home communities. And those also, I think, have less of an effect on tax system. Our concern is that sometimes, right, in an attempt to protect the homeowner, particularly in somewhere like, and some of the places with the most, what's what I'm looking for? Some of the places with the largest homestead exemptions are the places that have the most renters. So if you have a lot of renters, and they are much, much more likely to be cost burden, these are not second home communities, then what you are inadvertently doing, I think, is pushing more of the tax burden on the people who actually can't pay it relative to the other. But I do recognize for, once again, and I don't, as someone who lives in one of those communities and, my parents used to be homeowners in Narragansett, I get it, yes. So, sorry, yes. Yes.
Implemented a few years ago, our homestead exemption is for year-round residents. So it doesn't matter if you rent or own, because most of our residents are renters. And so they get a break, like that property owner would get a break for renting to people year-round. And then the homeowners, individual single-family homeowners, also get a lower rate for living in their house year-round. But it's still, we still need money. Ironically, we still need money. But if anyone is interested in that, we model it after the city of Boston. And so I can help you get in touch with people in Newport who did that. And then now Middletown is looking at a very similar program.
Point out, former Mayor Zay briefly worked at RIPEC, so I don't think he got the idea here, but I just trying to plug myself. Before my time. Any other questions?
Just a couple of points.
Yeah.
One of the things that the committee at the Rhode Island Foundation is looking at the funding formula. And in most states, a foundation-based formula has an identifiable local contribution and a tax rate associated with that. In Rhode Island, we don't. We adopted the funding formula almost 15 years ago. And the local contribution is assumed. So a lot of communities, so the urban core, it's difficult for them to meet the requirements of what we call the core instructional amount. They're heavily subsidized with state money in that regard. So we're looking at identifying a local municipal share to be part of the formula and to be articulated each year in the budget. So if you look at the budget right now, they have a column that identifies what the state's obligation is to your school district as part of the core structural amount. They don't have a municipal column. So I think one of the things that we'll be focusing on next year is to require the formula to reflect what the municipal share has to be, not what it should be, but what it has to be. So that way, they can't end run the formula in terms of what the local share needs to be in appropriation. For various reasons, municipalities have got themselves into some financial binds. Some, and Justine knows this better than I do, but some communities like Pawtucket, Woonsocket, and Central Falls lack the ability to attract commercial or industrial development because they don't have the space. So they rely on the same property taxes in and out every year. Providence, on the other hand, there are a couple of things that they do, which they have enormous $2.5 billion unfunded liability in their retirement, which means that their ARC payments go up. Annual required contribution eats up a lot of the property taxes that they generate. The other thing that Providence, and I've worked in the mayor's office of Providence for 6 years, has a tendency to do, and other communities do it as well, is known as tax incremental financing. So a business comes into the community, you want to secure that business, you offer them the opportunity to basically have what would normally be generated from sales and income tax that commercial property would generate, or development would generate, and you pour it back into financing the development. Schools don't have a say in that. So every time a municipality enters into a tax financing agreement, they're limiting their ability to collect property taxes. But schools don't play a role in that. Well, then they come back and they say, well, we don't have any money. Well, yeah, you committed it to pension obligation, and you're trying to attract a commercial development in your downtown, and you're not letting them pay taxes. You're letting it finance the development of the project. So those are a couple of things that we'll be looking at next year.
New developments, in the sense that the commercial rate in Providence is so high that it becomes, I think, difficult for them to attract businesses without that, which is part of the reason I think we recommend, when possible, having kind of more even tax rates between different types of property. But
Yeah, it varies from community to community, but when they established the mall in downtown Providence,
Yeah.
which is now rapidly becoming vacant thanks to Amazon, it was all done with tax incremental financing. They didn't pay income taxes or sales tax for an extended period of time. It all went back into paying down the debt for the developer on the facility. So that's an issue.
One of the earlier pie charts you showed was where Rhode Island is ranked versus the United States versus New England, right? New England's an expensive region. But then one of your further slides showed the pie chart of the percentages of state aid versus local aid and how it was kind of mirroring the national average. Do we mirror the New England average in terms of state aid versus local aid?
so we have a larger proportion compared to New England, but I think that it would be instructive to look at every state as far as that goes and to see how maybe we compare to Massachusetts and Connecticut. I don't have that data right on hand, but the reason I say that is because Vermont has a particularly unique system. And also when you look at the New England system, because so much of that money is Massachusetts, if you're looking at anytime you're looking at something that's a New England average, it's driven by, by Mass, right? And Connecticut to a certain extent, but it's driven by that Mass number. And so I think it's an interesting question to see how the pie is split across New England states, and I don't have that data at the time, but I can say that if you do a New England pie, that we are more local reliant still. That the New England pie is in between the US and Rhode Island. Well, so what Vermont does that's unique is that they essentially apply a state property tax. I'm not an expert on the intricacies of that system, which I have tried to get my bearing on, but wasn't able to commit quite enough time. But essentially, the constitutional right, Tim, you probably actually know more about this than me, the constitutional right to education, when it went through in Vermont, what they did is they started applying property tax at a state level in order to provide equity between districts.
They do redistribute it, so the
Yeah.
wealthy communities end up paying to subsidize less affluent communities. And that's surfaced here from time to time, but that's a hard sell.
It's I will say, RIPEC hasn't advocated for that in part because it's not, that would be a difficult thing to happen, right? When we're just trying to make some changes to our funding formula. But I will say there's some merit in that idea, right, that property tax gets levied more at the state level if your desire is to create educational equity.
On average, Connecticut and Mass pay their teachers a lot more than they do in Vermont. I think in Connecticut, it's about $2,300. It's close to $6,000 more in Massachusetts,
Yep.
which is, if you're an exceptional student graduating from Rhode Island College, You only have to travel about 10 or 15 minutes on 95 to find yourself in Mass. It's a better paying job.
I mean, that's a long time for a Highlander, but yes. I'm just kidding. Sorry. I'm not gonna- Bye. Thank you. I'm just kidding.
Any more questions for Justine?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.